Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 5, Chapter 18, The Winter Battle. Hindenburg had gained his way over Falkenhayn. He had now to make good against the Russians. No doubt in the course of the controversy which the last chapter has described, both he and Ludendorff had been led to paint the successes which would reward their plans in glowing colors. All the German and Austrian armies on the Eastern Front were to join in an immense double offensive in East Prussia and far off in the Carpathians against the Grand Duke's northern and southern flanks. The Russian armies were to be seized, as it were, by a crab of monstrous size and gripped simultaneously with each of its two widely spread claws. Falkenhayn had acidly pointed out that the two flanking attacks separated by 600 kilometers could not be brought into any effective relation. Hindenburg and Ludendorff were under no delusions. The operations on which they had set their hearts lay in the north. Reinforced by the four corps wrested from the Supreme Command, they now controlled three armies: their original 8th, the 9th, with which they had made their two unsuccessful thrusts at Warsaw, and the three new corps now uniting as a 10th Army under the command of General von Eichhorn. Their 8th and 9th armies stood at the end of January along lines drawn after the Battle of Lodz had ended in mid-December. The front of the 9th Army running north and south faced Warsaw at about 40 miles distance. The 8th Army crouched behind the course of the Angerup stream and the now frozen lakes. The interval of nearly 200 kilometers between them was filled by Landwehr and Landsturm troops, including Zastrov's corps, gathered at a second gleaning from the various German fortresses. Hindenburg and Ludendorff now proposed to use all these forces in combination. From what they had learned through the Russian wireless and other sources, they credited the Grand Duke with a gigantic plan of his own. They believed that as soon as the winter relented, he would strike at East Prussia by an upward drive towards Thorn and simultaneously in the north from the direction of Kovno. They intended to forestall him. The Russian armies were in no lack of men. Limitless supplies of obedient peasants were training behind the Tsar's frontiers, and as soon as uniforms, equipment, and ammunition could be provided, refilled the shattered formations or added to their numbers. It was not men that Russia lacked. They were in fact the only resources she possessed in superfluity. Her armies filled their immense front, and on paper presented totals larger than ever before. But trained officers and educated non-commissioned officers and clerks of every kind were far below the proportions required to handle such masses of soldiery. Moreover, not only cannon of every caliber and ammunition of every kind, but even rifles were hideously deficient. Although the Grand Duke, Ruzsky, and Ivanov still nourished offensive schemes, they were painfully conscious that the aggressive power of Russia had gravely declined since the early battles of the war. Ivanov, who already held the passes of the Carpathians, pressed the Stavka in long personal interviews to reinforce him for an invasion of the plains of Hungary. Ruzsky, to whose opinion the Grand Duke leaned, preferred to renew the advance through Poland westward and northwestward towards the German frontier. All these discussions were abruptly terminated by German action. According to the plan of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the left claw of what I have called the crab was to reach suddenly forward through the Angerup-Lötzen Lakes line to seize and destroy all the Russians within its grasp. For this purpose, the 9th Army would move a part of its forces, mostly of the 20th Corps, northwards from the level of Warsaw to the neighborhood of Ottelsburg and the fields where Tannenberg had been gained, while the three corps forming the new 10th Army would range themselves in the north in front of Insterburg. On the prescribed date, the right of the 8th Army would strike through Johannesburg towards Lück, while the 10th Army would march first northeast towards Tilsit, then turning continually southwards through Gumbinen and Stallupönen towards Grodno. Both these movements, as they developed, would expose their outer flanks to Russian attacks, in the north from Kovno and the line of the Niemen, and in the south from the line of the Bober, a tributary to the Narew. Not much danger was apprehended for the strong 10th Army, but the German forces advancing south of the lakes would be liable to heavy attacks on their right and right rear, and it was to protect them from this that the 9th Army troops had been brought to the scene. To mask the northward movement of the 9th Army troops, a sensational attack was made by the rest of the 9th Army at Bolimov on January 31. A feature of this battle intended to be much talked of was the first employment of 18,000 poison gas shells. The greatest interest was taken in this improvident disclosure of a terrible secret. Hoffmann betook himself to the church steeple of Bolimov in order to witness the wholesale stifling of the Russians, which the chemists had claimed would follow. He described the results as disappointing. The number of shells then thought magnificent was petty compared to later periods, and the intense cold robbed the poison gases of their expected diffusive power. Still, on January 31, what the Kaiser afterwards decided to call the winter battle in Masuria was in fact begun by this fierce demonstration towards Warsaw. It served its strategic purpose well. The Russian attention was violently drawn to this point, and they remained unconscious of the northward movement of troops from the 9th Army. Even more remarkable is it that no inkling came to the Stavka of the deployment and assembly in East Prussia of the 4 new army corps. They were all in their positions, 3 to the north and 1 to the south of the lake line, in the early days of February, without any warning having reached their prey. Indeed, the idea that any great operations could begin in such fearful wintry weather was scouted by the Russians' experience of their own climate. During February 5 and 6, tremendous snowstorms and blizzards lashed East Prussia. The cold was intense and the snow meter-deep, or whirled into frozen drifts and hummocks. Even the stubborn wills of Hindenburg and Ludendorff hesitated before launching their hardy troops into the storm, but they steeled their hearts. The immediate object of their design was the 10th Russian Army, which sat in its trenches from Goldab to Johannesburg in front of the Angerab lake line. They and their commander, General Sievers, suspected nothing of what was passing behind the shield of German fortifications. They passed the 6th and 7th in shoveling the snow out of their trenches. The right pincer of the German crab-claw began to move on the 7th. General Litzmann with the 11th Reserve Corps and the 2nd Division struck from Johannesburg towards Lück. On the 8th, the left pincer, the whole of the German 10th Army, attacked between the Gumbinen-Königsberg Railway and the Memel River. The 3 corps of this army, the 21st, 39th Reserve, and 38th Reserve from north to south, drove the Russian covering troops before them and began immediately to turn the right and menace the Russian retreat. The enormous difficulties of the weather did not prevent the steady progress of the German army. It continued to extend its enveloping movement around the Russian right, wheeling continually to the southward. On the night of the 9th to 10th, the 21st Corps, after an uninterrupted march of 29 hours, had reached Schierwind and Władysławów. The center course had passed Pikalen, and the army front faced almost south at right angles to the original Russian position. On the 10th, the 21st Corps reached Wilkowiski. cutting the railway to Kovno, and the 29th Reserve Corps in the center reached Virballen, where an entire Russian division, which was in reserve, was surprised and destroyed with a loss of 10,000 prisoners and 6 guns. Thus the line of retreat of the whole of the Russian right upon Kovno was severed. Vigorous attacks by Russian dismounted cavalry from Kovno upon the left and rear of the 21st Corps were beaten off, but the threat from Kovno was considered sufficient to require the movement of a Landwehr division from the German right to ward off such interference. On the 12th, the German 10th Army front ran from Mariampol and Kalvaria to the neighborhood of Goldap, and the Russian center began to be seriously threatened. Indeed, there were now left but 2 lines of retreat for the whole of General Siever's army. The first towards the Niemen through Olita, and the second through the forest of Augustov. Meanwhile, in the south, the 11th Reserve Corps was moving on Lück to cut the Augustov road. Here they encountered tenacious Russian resistance. The road and railway junctions of Lück were now vital. Bitter fighting with repeated Russian counterattacks continued in this area in the most severe weather during the whole of the 12th. Valiantly the Russians continued to defend themselves. The German southern force, unable to make progress frontally, extended its right towards Krajewo. Meanwhile, the whole front of the 8th Army had broken out from behind the Angerab position and now fell upon the Russians in front of them. By the evening of the 13th, they were close to Magrabova, Siever's old headquarters, and Suwalki. On this day, the defenders of Lück, with both their flanks turned and their rear menaced, withdrew in good order from the positions they had so bravely held. The Germans entered Lück on the 14th, capturing 5,000 prisoners in the town. The Kaiser, closely following up the advance, visited the town that day and congratulated his victorious troops. The pincers were closing fast upon the Russian 10th Army. From the moment when these 2 great movements upon his flanks were revealed, General Sievers thought only of retreat. Burning villages behind them, but leaving nevertheless vast quantities of stores and provisions, over 350,000 Russians marched eastward as fast as possible. The roads became choked with transport in inextricable confusion. Infantry floundered through the snowdrifts. The wheeling advance of the German 10th Army drove all these masses of men remorselessly southward. Large numbers of Russians broke and tore their way here and there through the encircling grip to the east and northeast. Masses of prisoners were taken, and always the main body of the Russian army was driven towards Augustov Forest. Everywhere the Russian rearguards fought with the greatest stubbornness to secure the escape of their comrades. And as the Germans could only drag their artillery forward by using as many as 18 horses to a single gun, their infantry were often stopped. The Russian counterattacks from Kovno to prevent the imminent encirclement of General Sievers continued vigorously in the north. On the 13th, in the south, other strong efforts were made by Russian forces debouching from the small fortress of Osowets towards Lück. These again were warded off by the Germans after hard fighting. The frost had now broken, and a sudden thaw converted the roads into quagmires of mud. By the night of the 15th, the Russian 3rd and 26th Corps had passed Augustov, or traversed the forest with heavy losses and lay in great disorder, but outside the Claw, around Grodno. But the Russian 20th Corps, with large numbers of stragglers and masses of transport and artillery, were still in the forest. Their rearguards held its western edge with determination, and now Eichhorn, his right and center arrested, resolved to repeat the audacious maneuver which General von François had used at Tannenberg. He ordered his left corps, the 21st, to move southward round the northern side of the forest, regardless of the peril which would threaten them in the rear from the fortress of Grodno. During the 15th, 16th, and 17th, this thin line of Germans, resolutely intent upon the encirclement of whatever Russians might be in their clutches, pressed continually forward, defending themselves both from the troops breaking out of the trap and from the Russian counterattacks from Grodno. On the 18th, the forest was completely encircled. Thus hopelessly trapped, the Russian 20th Corps fought on with supreme devotion. For 4 days and nights they hurled themselves in vain against the thin, invincible lines. On the 21st, the crab claw closed and seized its prey. 30,000 men, with 11 generals and 200 guns, laid down their arms, and many thousand German prisoners taken in the earlier fighting were also rescued by their countrymen. Meanwhile, the Eighth Army had advanced to the line of the Bobr, hoping to attack the fortress of Ossowetz. This small place played almost as important a part as Lötzen. Stoutly defended, it endured heavy bombardments and repeated attacks. Its force were planted on the only eminences of the great plain in which it stood. The utmost efforts of the Germans were fruitless against it. To the southward behind the Bobr, strongly entrenched, the 3rd Siberian Corps also resisted with constancy in what appeared to the Germans to be formidable entrenchments. Indeed, the troops declared that they were semi-permanent works strengthened with concrete. Hoffmann disbelieved this and was in fact right, but it was thought impossible to demand further sacrifices from the willing but now completely exhausted Germans. And about the same time as the Russians in the forest were surrounded, the winter battle came to a close. The whole Russian 10th Army had not been entrapped, but 110,000 prisoners and upwards of 300 guns were the prizes of the victors, and at least another 100,000 Russians had perished under the fire of the enemy, or sunk forever in the snowdrifts or the mud. Although many had escaped and 2 corps still preserved some semblance of order, the Russian 10th Army had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. This awful battle against the worst that nature or warring man could do constitutes an episode unparalleled in military history. Even the massive Hindenburg was chilled by its ghastly character. The name, he says, of the winter battle in Masuria, charms like an icy wind or the silence of death. As men look back on the course of this battle, they will only stand and ask themselves, have earthly beings really done these things, or is it all but a fable or a phantom? Are not these marches in the winter nights, that camp in the icy snowstorm, and that last phase of the battle in the forest of Augustov so terrible for the enemy, but the creation of an inspired human fancy? He adds further, in spite of the great tactical success, we failed strategically. We had once more managed practically to destroy one of the Russian armies, but fresh enemy forces had immediately come up to take its place, drawn from other fronts to which they had not been pinned down. We could not achieve a decisive result. The superiority of the Russians was too great. Hindenburg could write thus of the winter battle, in spite of all its trophies. His confession of strategic barrenness applied even more forcibly to the Austrian operations at the other extreme of the Eastern Front. The southern claw of the crab had grasped nothing. Conrad's advance from the Carpathian passes was vigorously resisted. He failed even to cross the Dunajec in force. Meanwhile, the Russian investment of Przemysl, siege it could not be called, continued. It appeared that that great fortress, the main base and depot of all the Austrian armies which had been ranged in Galicia at the outbreak of war, had only been victualled for 3 months. The temporary relief effected in October had not been sufficient to replenish its supplies. When the blockade closed again on November 9, the garrison was already straitened. Taught by their unsuccessful assault in October, the Russians patiently awaited the progress of famine. On March 18, the failure of the southern offensive being manifest, the Austrian garrison made, like Bazaine from Metz, a respectable but hopeless sortie, on the repulse of which the commander proposed capitulation. This was a considerable event, and the prizes of the victors were impressive. Besides the stronghold with all its establishments, over 100,000 prisoners and 1,000 guns were surrendered by Austria to Russia. The Russian investing army of the same size was liberated for further tasks. Thus, the grandiose operation, in the name of which Hindenburg and Ludendorff had conjured Falkenhayn's army corps from the west, and in opposing which Falkenhayn had narrowly escaped dismissal, came to the sterile end he had predicted. He was near enough to the summit of power to be able, as occasion served, to point the moral. This was the first step in the revival of his assaulted reputation and impugned authority.